Kapag Puno na ang Salop. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel where we bring the most iconic action stories to life. Today we are diving into a true movie story, Kapag Puno na ang Salop. Kapag Puno na ang Salop, lit. When the Gantan is Full, is a 1987 Filipino action film directed by Arturo Sanagustin and starring Fernando Poe Jr., also producer, Garcia, Paquito Diaz, Jose Romulo, Dencio Padilla, Roy Alvarez, and Rowena Moran. Produced by FPJ Productions, the film was released on November 26, 1987. Critic Luciano E. Soriano of the Manila Standard gave the film a positive review, praising the dialogue and Poe and Garcia's performances, which elevate its formulaic plot. Kapag Puno na ang Salop was followed by two sequels, Hko ang Huhusga in 1989, and Hindi Ka na Sasakatan ng Ara, Kapag Puno na ang Salop Part 3 in 1990. Cast and characters: Fernando Poe Jr. as P/Sergeant Isagani Guerrero. Eddie Garcia as Judge Ricardo Valderrama. Paquito Diaz as Paquito Maaman. Jose Romulo. Dencio Padilla as Sergeant Sybil. Roy Alvarez as Dante. Rowena Moran. Lito Anzures as Mang Porong, Dante's uncle, 2. Jimmy Fabregas as a doctor. Augusto Victa. Bernie Zarate. Manding Fernandez. Delia Razan. Rudy Maya. Renee Hawkins. Luis Benedicto. Ida Pettido. Eddie Toison. Mel Arca. Jimmy Reyes. Gwen Colmenares. Kapag Puno na ang Salop was released on November 26, 1987. It had a successful opening at the box office despite the then ongoing Super Typhoon Sison, internationally known as Typhoon Dina. Luciano E. Soriano of the Manila Standard gave Kapag Puno na ang Salop a positive review, praising its clever dialogue and the larger-than-life performances of Poe and Garcia despite it utilizing the same narrative formula as Poe's other action films. He stated that, "Never mind if we have seen this before. Poe knows how to hold the audience spellbound." Typhoon Nina, known in the Philippines as Super Typhoon Sison, was the most intense typhoon to strike the Philippines since Typhoon Irma in 1981. Typhoon Nina originated from an area of convection near the Marshall Islands in mid-November 1987. It gradually became better organized, and on November 19, was first classified as a tropical cyclone. Moving west-northwest, Nina attained tropical storm intensity that evening. Late on November 20, Nina passed through the Chuuk Lagoon in the Federated States of Micronesia. After a brief pause in intensification, Nina intensified into a typhoon on November 22. 2 days later, the typhoon intensified suddenly, before attaining its peak 10-minute intensity of 165 km per hour, 105 miles per hour, 90 knots. During the afternoon of November 25, Nina moved ashore in southern Luzon at the same intensity. It gradually weakened over land, before entering the South China Sea and turning to the north. By November 30, Nina dissipated. Across the Chuuk Lagoon, 4 people were killed and damage ranged from $30 to $40 million, $1,987. In the capital of Weno, 85% of dwellings and 50% of government buildings were damaged. Throughout the atoll, at least 1,000 people were rendered homeless, approximately 1,000 houses were damaged, and 39 injuries were reported. While crossing the Philippines, Nina brought extensive damage to the northern portion of the island group. The town of Matnog sustained the worst damage from the typhoon, where 287 people died. 61 people died in the city of Sorsogon, where 98% of all structures were either damaged or destroyed. 400 people died, 80% of all crops were destroyed, and 90% of all homes were either damaged or destroyed in the Sorsogon province. Nearby, in the Albay province, 73 people were killed. Throughout both the Albay and Sorsogon provinces, 4/5 of all schools and half of all public infrastructure were destroyed. Elsewhere, in Boac, 80% of homes lost their roofs. In Bacacay, 18 of the village's 200 homes were destroyed. However, the capital city of Manila avoided the brunt of the typhoon. Throughout the Philippines, approximately 114,000 people sought shelter, approximately 90,000 houses were destroyed, leaving more than 150,000 homeless. Nationwide, damage from the storm totaled $54.5 million and 979 people perished. An area of convection developed within near the Marshall Islands in mid-November. Initially, convection waxed and waned, but on November 17, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, JTWC, started tracking the system. At this time, the system developed deep convection as well as good outflow. The JTWC issued a Tropical Cyclone Formation Alert, TCFA, at 0100 UTC on November 19 due to a significant increase in organization. 5 hours later, the Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, started monitoring the system. 2. NB1, continuing to rapidly become better organized while moving west-northwest. The cyclone was classified as a tropical depression by the JTWC at midday. 1. On the evening of November 19, both the JTWC and the JMA upgraded the system to tropical storm, prompting JTWC to name the system as Nina, shortly after developing banding features. 4. NB2, initially forecast by the JTWC to move slowly, instead, Nina accelerated while gradually intensifying. At 1600 UTC on November 20, Tropical Storm Nina passed 75 kilometers, 45 miles, 40 nmi, south of Bueno Island in the Chuck Lagoon. 2 hours later, the JMA upgraded Nina to a severe tropical storm. 2. After moving away from the island on the morning of November 21, the JTWC upgraded Nina to a typhoon at 1200 UTC. 1. With the JMA following suit early on November 22. 2. Shortly thereafter, Nina made its closest approach to Ulithi, passing 110 kilometers, 70 miles, 60 nmi, to the north. At 1600 UTC, Nina tracked about 175 kilometers, 110 miles, 95 nmi, north of Yap. 1. Typhoon Nina accelerated slightly as it traversed the open waters of the Philippine Sea. The storm continued to slowly deepen, though early on November 23, the system leveled off in intensity. 1. That day, the Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical, and Astronomical Services Administration, PAGASA, also monitored the storm and assigned it with the local name Sison, upon entering the Philippine Area of Responsibility. 6. However, midday on November 24, Nina entered a phase of explosive intensification at a rate of 1.33 mba, 0.039 nhg, an hour. 1. Despite this, the JMA only increased the intensity slightly to 170 km per hour, 105 miles per hour, 90 knots. 2. After developing a well-defined eye, the JTWC reported that Nina attained its peak intensity of 270 km per hour, 170 miles per hour, 145 knots, making it a low-end Category 5 system on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. At 1500 UTC on November 25, Nina moved ashore as it made landfall along the southern tip of Luzon at its peak intensity. 1. Despite land interaction, little change in strength occurred until 0000 UTC on November 26. At that time, the system began to weaken. 2. After traversing Luzon and Mindoro, the JTWC reduced the wind speed of the typhoon to 110 miles per hour, 175 kilometers per hour, 95 knots. Although no eye was visible on satellite imagery, radar imagery indicated that an eye was present, but cloud filed. Henceforth, the JTWC increased the intensity of Nina to 185 kilometers per hour, 115 miles per hour, 100 knots, equivalent to a weak Category 3 hurricane. 1. According to the JMA, however, Nina never re-intensified. 2. By 0000 UTC on November 27, the low and mid-level circulations began to decouple, deeply thwarting many JTWC forecasters. During this time, the cyclone posed a serious threat to southern China and Hong Kong. Nina instead veered northward while gradually weakening. 1. By midday on November 27, the JMA had reduced the intensity of Nina to 130 kilometers per hour, 80 miles per hour, 70 knots. 2. Early on November 28, an eye once again became visible on satellite imagery. However, no re-intensification occurred. By the afternoon, increased wind shear took toll on the cyclone, causing Nina to become less organized due to deep convection being sheared off to the east-northeast. Thus, the JTWC expected Nina to move into the Luzon Straits and rapidly transitioned into an extratropical cyclone. After meandering within the South China Sea, Nina turned south, before dissipating on November 29. Wink with a frown. 1. The JMA continued to monitor its remnants until 0000 UTC on November 30. 2. Preparation and impact. Federated States of Micronesia. While passing near Truk, which has a population of 42,007, Typhoon Nina inflicted heavy crop damage on the area. 7. In the capital of Weno, 85% of homes and 50% of government buildings were damaged. 8. There, communication lines were downed. 9. And hundreds of people were evacuated. 7. Throughout the atoll, 4 people died. 9. Including a woman and a 14-year-old boy killed by a fallen breadfruit tree, and an 11-year-old girl died after her leg was struck by a piece of flying metal. 7. 1 person was reported missing. Over 1,000 people were rendered homeless. 10. While roughly 1,000 homes were damaged. 11. Damaged from the storm ranged from $30 to $40 million, $1,987, and 39 were wounded. 12. Philippines. Prior to landfall, around 10 provinces, 13, including most of Luzon, was placed under a typhoon alert. 14. However, many fishermen ignored the alerts and refused to flee to higher ground. 15. Furthermore, Philippine Airlines canceled 21 domestic flights and 3 international flights. 13. Numerous other flights were delayed. 16. Local authorities also suspended school classes. 13. Typhoon Nina brought widespread damage to much of the northern Philippines. 17. It was the strongest system to strike the archipelago since Typhoon Irma in 1981. 17. The capital city of Manila was spared the worst of Nina. There, only minor damage and power outages were reported. 18. Though 800 were evacuated to shelters due to flooding and the city's airport closed. 19. 2 men were crushed to death in Lucena City. 13. The worst effects of the storm were felt in Naknak. 20. Where 287 people drowned due to storm surge. 17. In nearby Sorsogon City, 61 fatalities occurred. 21. where 98% of the city's buildings were damaged or destroyed and its supply of drinking water was cut off. 22. Throughout the Sorsogon province, 80% of all crops were destroyed. 23. And 90% of all homes were either damaged or destroyed. 24. Province-wide, 400 people died. 22. In the Albay province, 73 people were killed. 25. Throughout both the Albay and Sorsogon provinces combined, 80% of all schools and 50% of all public buildings were demolished. 22. Elsewhere, 7 casualties occurred in the Laguna province, while 1 person perished each in San Pablo, Batangas, Marinduque, and Mindoro Oriental. 22. 32 people were killed in the Camarines Sur province and 23 other people died in Camarines Norte. 26. 5 others were killed in the Masbate province. 27. And 1 died in Marinduque. 28. In Boise, the capital of Marinduque, 80% of all dwellings lost their roofs and damage was severe to churches, schools, and city buildings. 29. In Bacacay, situated to the southeast of Legazpi, all but 15 of the town's 200 dwellings were leveled. 22. Although there were no deaths, Samar Island also suffered severe damage. 30. Offshore, 5 fishermen perished and a tugboat and cargo ship were rendered missing due to rough seas. 17. Nina also brought widespread power outages to most of Luzon wing with a frown. 31. Consequently, trading on the nation's 2 biggest stock exchange was suspended for November 26, 24. Overall, around 114,000 persons were evacuated to shelters. 17. 153,339 were listed homeless. 32. And 1,075 were wounded. 33. A total of 90,173 homes were demolished due to Nina, while an additional 109,633 were partially destroyed. 34. Nationwide, 979 people were killed. 35. In all, damage from the storm totaled $54.5 million, $1,987 US, 36. NB3, $7.9 million of which occurred along the Baikal region. 33. Hong Kong and Macau. Although Nina was rapidly weakening over the South China Sea, the storm brought 4.7 millimeters, 0.19 in, of rain to Hong Kong. 37. Prompting a tropical cyclone signal for nearby Macau. 38. Temperatures at the Hong Kong Observatory fell to 9.9 degrees Celsius, and wind speed was recorded at 53 miles per hour, 85 kilometers per hour, at Waglan Island. Due to the damage wrought by Nina, President Corazon Aquino declared 4 Luzon provinces a disaster area. 17. Initially, only 11 provinces were declared a state of emergency. 42. But by November 29, this total increased to 17. 43. United States Ambassador Nicholas Platt released $25,000 in emergency aid and sent officials to help with relief efforts. 33. The American Red Cross also provided $24,000 worth of aid to post-storm victims. 22. The Roman Catholic Church also provided $160,000 worth of food to the nation. 44. Additionally, Social Welfare and Development Secretary Mita Pardo de Tavera donated $50,000 for emergency disaster relief. 42. Though many locals complained that this aid was too little and too late. 22. Around 11,000 pounds, 5,000 kilograms, of rice was donated for use in 8 provinces. 22. And on December 1, an additional 35,000 pounds, 16,000 kilograms, of aid was airlifted to the region. 45. Belgium also launched a 4-month program to help 380,000 post-storm victims. 34. Most flights in and out of Manila had returned to a normal schedule by November 28, 25. In all, 9 countries and several foreign Red Cross organizations responded by providing aid, totaling roughly $700,000 worth of value, mostly from Japan. 34. The name Sisan was retrospectively retired by Pagasa from the list of tropical cyclones in the country. It was replaced by Sendan. Typically, tropical cyclones form at least 5.0 degrees of latitude north and south of the equator, or at least 300 nautical miles, 556 kilometers, 345 miles, of the equator. Despite the presence of sufficiently warm sea surface temperatures and generally low wind shear, tropical cyclogenesis is uncommon at these latitudes due to a lack of the Coriolis force, which causes cyclones to spin. On rare occasions, tropical cyclones can develop within 5 degrees of the equator, though it is more prevalent in the northwestern Pacific Ocean. Various factors converge to produce a tropical cyclone, including sufficiently warm sea surface temperatures, low wind shear, ample moisture, and enough atmospheric instability to produce thunderstorms. In addition, weather disturbances typically need to be far enough away from the equator to spin, known as vorticity. This is due to increasing Coriolis force closer to the poles, and which is 0 at the equator. 2, 3, 4. One associated phenomenon often seen with low-latitude cyclones is the equatorial westerly wind burst, which allows for sufficient shear vorticity on both sides of the equator to support tropical cyclogenesis. 5. Westerly wind bursts are typically the most common in the equatorial western Pacific Ocean. Philippine typhoon strikes that year. Residual moisture from the tropical cyclone indirectly contributed to extensive flooding in Malaysia. Uter originated from an area of disturbed weather that organized into a tropical depression on December 7 west-southwest of Yap. The cyclone steadily progressed westward while gradually intensifying, reaching tropical storm intensity late on December 7. On December 9 and the ensuing 2 days, Uter crossed the central Philippines and reached typhoon strength before weakening somewhat upon entry into the South China Sea. Re-intensification ensued afterwards, and Uter reached its peak intensity on December 13 with maximum sustained winds of 155 km per hour, 100 miles per hour, shortly after regaining typhoon strength, NB1. However, wind shear and dry air began to take its toll on Uter thereafter, quickly weakening the storm until its dissipation on December 15. Due to the destruction wrought by Typhoon Durian just weeks prior, preparations began in earnest in the Philippines. Over 91,000 people were evacuated from areas at risk, primarily from Albay. 2 major summits to be held in Cebu were postponed as a result of the forecast inclement weather. In addition, recovery efforts for victims of Durian had to be suspended and all domestic flights in the Philippines were canceled. Uter's impacts in the central Philippines were extensive, with 30 casualties reported and the damage toll reaching $15.80 million. 3. Widespread power outages affected the entirety of eastern Visayas. Numerous ships sunk as a result of rough seas generated by the typhoon, including a ferry carrying 104 passengers and crew. Following the storm, relief agencies began to allocate resources to those affected by the typhoon, in turn also adding to relief efforts for the 3 Philippine typhoons which preceded Ura. Precautionary efforts also took place in Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, while the Paracel Islands sustained marked damage but no fatalities. Although the storm mostly dissipated in the South China Sea, Uter's remnant moisture later contributed in part to Peninsular Malaysia's worst flood event in recorded history, as copious amounts of precipitation fell over a short, 4-day period. 8 people were killed by the floods, which were worst in Kota Tinggi and Sidamak district. Meteorological history. Map showing the track upon which Uter traversed, The track begins on the right of the image and ends slightly above left center. Map plotting the storm's track and intensity, according to the Saffir-Simpson scale. Map key. The predecessor to Typhoon Yuta was first noted by the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, JTWC, as a cluster of thunderstorms southeast of Chuuk on December 2, NB2. Over the next few days, a center of circulation accompanied by intermittent shower activity began to develop in the presence of favorable conditions. 1. At midnight UTC on December 7, the Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, determined that the disturbance had become sufficiently organized to be considered a tropical depression wink with a frown 5, NB3, at the time the cyclone was centered 175 kilometers, 110 miles, west-southwest of Yap. Tracking westward under the influence of a powerful subtropical ridge to its north, the depression strengthened into a tropical storm at 1800 hours Universal Time Coordinated. In accordance, the storm was given the name Yuta. This name had been submitted by the United States and means squall line. 1. Yuta's development following its naming was slow, but quickened as the tropical storm neared the Philippines. The tropical cyclone reached the southeastern coast of Samar by 6 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated on December 9 and began tracking through the central Philippine archipelago over the next 2 days. Despite its interaction with the nearby islands, 1. Yuta continued to strengthen without much impediment and reached typhoon strength in the Visayan Sea at 12 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated that day. 12 hours later, the typhoon attained an initial peak intensity with maximum sustained winds of 140 km per hour, 85 miles per hour, and a minimum barometric pressure of 955 bar, HVA, 28.20 nhg, in the Cebrian Sea according to the JMA. 5. The JTWC analyzed an intensity of 185 km per hour, 115 miles per hour at that time. 1. By 12 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated on December 10, Yuta had emerged into the South China Sea. 5. Although Yuta tracked back over water on December 10, the storm began to weaken due to increasing wind shear and dry air from the west. 1. As a result, the JMA downgraded Yuta to severe tropical storm intensity upon its emergence into the South China Sea. 5. Despite these hindering conditions, the storm's improved outflow was sufficient to enable redevelopment. 1. At 1800 hours Universal Time Coordinated on December 11, the JMA once again upgraded the system to typhoon strength southeast of Hainan. Intensification continued until Yuta peaked with winds of 155 km per hour, 100 miles per hour, and a minimum pressure of 945 bar, HVA, 27.91 nhg, the next day. 5. This strength was held for only 12 hours before Yuta's outflow began to succumb to the wind shear and dry air stemming from the monsoonal flow it had previously suppressed. 1. 6. Traveling in a tight clockwise loop, the typhoon rapidly weakened on December 13. By the following day Yuta was a minimal tropical storm. At 6 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated on December 14, the storm degenerated into a tropical depression and continued to execute a small anticyclonic loop before dissipating on December 15. 5. Preparations, impact, and aftermath. Philippines. Satellite image of a sprawling tropical cyclone, centered at the image's center. The white clouds of the storm takes up most of the image, with dark blue season visible on the image's extremities. Tropical storm Yuta making landfall in the Philippines on December 9. Although the Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical, and Astronomical Services Administration, PAGASA, did not recommend their delay. 7. Both the 2006 ASEAN and East Asia summits in Cebu City were postponed due to the threat of Yuta impacting the city. Officials denied allegations that the postponements were instead due to a possible terrorist attack. 8. This was the first time that an ASEAN summit had been postponed due to inclement weather. 9. Potentially hazardous conditions also delayed humanitarian aid to victims of Typhoon Durian, which struck the Philippines in late November. 10. The first public storm warning signals for the Philippines were issued by the Pagasa on December 8 for several islands in the central Philippines. 11. The third level of the Fortio warning system was issued for Samar, Leyte, and Biliran. 12. With landfall imminent on December 9. 15,000 people were evacuated to temporary evacuation shelters from around 12 villages. 13. This figure increased to 59,000 people as landfall occurred and later to 91,121 with the storm passing over the Philippines. 14. Most of the evacuees were from Albay due to fears of deadly mudslides and lahars associated with Mount Mayon as witnessed during Typhoon Durian. 15. 16. In addition, the Philippines Office of Civil Defense considered relocating Typhoon Durian refugees in the Bicol region to special holding areas. 17. Other domestic flights were also canceled. 18. Political map showing some provinces in the central Philippines highlighted in accordance with the highest public storm warning signals that were issued for them during the passage of Uter. The path that the typhoon took is superimposed on the map. Map of the highest public storm warning signals by province raised by the Pagasa due to Uter. Uter caused extensive power outages in Cebu, Leyte, and Boracay. 14. Resulting in widespread loss of telecommunication. 19. A single electric pole in northern Cebu caught fire during the storm, cutting out power to 8 peripheral towns. Downtown Tacloban also suffered a blackout. 20. Off of Boracay, a boat operator was killed after their ship capsized. 14. Another 67 ships, which consisted of speedboats and ferries, sunk during the storm's passage. 21. Buildings were unroofed and trees were torn apart on the island, littering its beaches with debris. 19. A barge was forced by large waves into the pier at San Agustin, Romblon, resulting in the spilling of 25,000 L, 6,600 gallons, of diesel fuel. 22. 2 children were killed in Tacloban and Capais as a result of falling trees. An additional 3 people in Capais were feared to have drowned due to floods. 14. 2,000 people became stranded after the Philippine Coast Guard canceled the operation of 43 ferry services. 23. Similarly, 8,000 people became stranded at seaports after the Coast Guard barred vessels from sailing. 24. Extensive damage occurred in Occidental Mindoro, where 422 homes were destroyed and an additional 1,421 damaged. 25. Rough seas caused the outriggers on a ferry between Batangas and Puerto Galera, Oriental Mindoro to break apart, causing the ship to begin disintegrating offshore. However, the 104 passengers and crew on board were able to escape and were later rescued. 26. Further north in southern Luzon, roads and bridges were rendered impassable after sustaining damage. 27. Upon emerging to the South China Sea on October 25, sunken struggled to intensify, with the continued effects of land interaction in the eastern quadrant. Late on the same day, the JTWC noted that Suntin had started to develop banding over its northern and southern peripheries, with deep convection wrapping to its center. At 6 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated the next day, the JMA upgraded Suntin to a severe tropical storm, as it continued westward under the influence of the subtropical ridge to its north, leaving the PA. 12 hours later, the JTWC upgraded Suntin to a typhoon, as its structure continued to improve, with its center having tightly curved banding. 23, the JMA would not upgrade Suntin to a typhoon until 6 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated on October 27, when it developed a 15 nautical mile wide, 28 kilometers, I-24, 25. Suntin then reached its peak intensity 6 hours later, as it rapidly intensified to a Category 3 equivalent typhoon, while entering a hostile environment of moderate wind shear and strong westerlies to its north. With its ice soon filled, the system started weakening by the next day, as it slowed its movement, with wind shear increasing. As a result, the JTWC downgraded Suntin to a Category 2 equivalent typhoon, as it turned to the north-northwest. By 12 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated that same day, the JMA downgraded the system to a severe tropical storm. As it made landfall between Nam Dinh Province, Thái Bình Province in Vietnam, 30, the JMA downgraded Suntin to a tropical storm, while the JTWC downgraded the system to a Category 1 equivalent typhoon, 12, 31. The JTWC downgraded Suntin to a tropical storm and issued their final advisory at midnight UTC on October 29, as it turned northeast while weakening from land interaction. 6 hours later, the JMA issued their final advisory on the system, as it weakened to a tropical depression. Suntin then dissipated late on the same day. The track and the public storm warning signal of Tropical Storm Ophel during it affects the central Philippines. Areas under the orange color are signal number 2 while the light green color are signal number 1. Suntin was forecast to hit central Philippines. However, it impacted the entire islands with almost every provinces of the country receiving storm signals. The Pagasa issued storm signals as the storm approached. Storm signal number 1 was hoisted over Surigao del Norte, Surigao del Sur, Hagizan del Norte, Leyte provinces, western and eastern Samar. As the tropical depression neared the country, it intensified into a tropical storm. Signal number 2 was hoisted over Cebu, Leyte provinces, Samar provinces, and Surigao provinces. On October 24, the storm capsized 6 boats in Tacloban City, 35. It hardly hit Cebu with rain and winds, prompting classes in Cebu City to be suspended the next day, 36. Authorities in the Philippines confirmed at least 4 deaths, an 8-year-old boy who drowned, 2 men crushed by falling trees, and an elderly man who died from hypothermia. Widespread flooding was reported as rivers burst their banks, in some instances rising as much as 12.8 meters in 24 hours. A cargo ship, called the ML Lady RP2, sank with around 1,200 sacks of copper near Zamboanga City at the height of the storm. Strong winds derailed a train in Quezon. Throughout the country, 27 people were killed by the storm and damage amounted to PHP 155 million, $3.74 million US. The center warned ships and people in affected areas to be careful, urging authorities to take full precautions. It was forecast up to 80 centimeters of precipitation that day along the coast of eastern and southern Hainan province and eastern coast of Liao Peninsula. In Vietnam, the typhoon moved along the Tonkin Gulf, ravaging the coastal provinces of Nha, Thanh Hoa, Ninh Ben, and Thái Bình before making landfall 20 kilometers west of Halong Bay on October 29. A weather station on Han Dao Island recorded sustained winds of 130 kilometers per hour, 81 miles per hour. A station in Thái Bình City recorded sustained winds of 112 kilometers per hour, 69 miles per hour, and gusts of 162 kilometers per hour, 101 miles per hour, while the Van Lai Meteorological Station, at coordinates 20 degrees 7 minutes 17.0 seconds north, 106 degrees 18 minutes 10.8 seconds east in Nam Dinh Province, recorded sustained winds of 108 kilometers per hour, 67 miles per hour, and gusts of 155 kilometers per hour, 96 miles per hour. Rainfall in some areas of northern Vietnam exceeded 300 millimeters, with Quang Ha, Quang Ninh receiving 375 millimeters, Qua Cam, Haiphong receiving 334 millimeters, and Thai Dun City receiving 404 mm, 48, a 180 meters, 590 feet, tall mast tower in Nam Dinh collapsed during the storm. 49. The total of 8 people were killed in the country while 3 others were listed as missing. Another 90 people were injured in various accidents related to the typhoon. In all, 429 homes collapsed and 55,251 were damaged, while about 95,000 hectares, 235,000 acres, of crops were flooded. The storm caused 11 trillion Vietnamese dong, $530 million US dollars, 2012 US dollars, in damage. Typhoon Bopha, known in the Philippines as Super Typhoon Pablo, was a compact but powerful and catastrophic tropical cyclone that became the strongest on record to ever affect the Philippine island of Mindanao, making landfall as a Category 5 super typhoon with winds of 175 miles per hour, 282 kilometers per hour. 1. The 24th tropical storm, along with being the 4th and final super typhoon of the 2012 Pacific typhoon season, Bopha originated unusually close to the equator, becoming the second most southerly Category 5 super typhoon, reaching a minimum latitude of 7.4 degrees north on December 3, 2012, as only Typhoon Moise of 1964 came closer to the equator at this strength, at 7.3 degree N1, after first making landfall in Palau, where it destroyed houses, disrupted communications, and caused power outages, flooding, and uprooted trees. Bopha made landfall late on December 3 in Mindanao. The storm caused widespread destruction on Mindanao, leaving thousands of people homeless and killing 1,901 people. After hitting Davao Oriental and Davao da Oro provinces, Bopha shifted through the southern and central regions of Mindanao, cutting power to 2 provinces and triggering landslides. More than 170,000 people fled to evacuation centers, as the system moved to the South China Sea west of the Palawan Island province, eventually dissipating on December 9. On November 23, the United States Joint Typhoon Warning Center, JTWC, reported that a tropical disturbance had persisted about 650 kilometers, 405 miles, to the south of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia. 5. At the time, bands of atmospheric convection were flaring around the disturbance's poorly defined low-level circulation center, while the system was located in an area of moderate vertical wind shear with sea surface temperatures of 28 to 30 degrees Celsius, 82 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. 5. Over the next couple of days, the system's low-level circulation center slowly consolidated further and came under the influence of a developing anticyclone, which allowed vertical wind shear to become more favorable for tropical cyclogenesis. On November 25, the JTWC and the Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, reported that disturbance had developed into a tropical depression, with the former classifying it as Tropical Depression 26W. At this time, the system was located about 530 kilometers, 330 miles, to the southeast of Chuuk State and was moving towards the west-northwest, along the southern edge of a subtropical ridge of high pressure that was located to the south of Japan. Bopha on December 1, the previous day before its initial peak intensity. As the system continued to intensify, organized bands of thunderstorms began to develop rapidly around the system, mostly on the western half of the storm. They later merged with Bofa, which led to the system's increase in size. Several hot towers also began to rise up near the low-level circulation center, with one of the hot towers reaching 17 kilometers, 11 miles, into the atmosphere. 22. At around the same time, on November 30th, a ragged, eye-like feature appeared in microwave imagery. 23, which later transitioned into a pinhole eye by December 1, 24. The stadium effect was also observed in the thick convection surrounding the eye wall, involving thin strips of clouds from the eye wall curve outward from the surface with height. At around the same time the system's eye structure improved, it began to explosively intensify, becoming a Category 4 storm in 18 hours, while being less than 5 degrees from the equator. On December 1st, the system, as a Category 4 typhoon, maintained a well-defined, small eye, which later dissipated, but reformed by December 2nd. As Bofa strengthened further into a super typhoon on December 2nd, the well-defined eye underwent a small eye wall replacement cycle by late December 2nd, and by 10 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated on December 2nd, the system developed double eye walls, which were only seen in microwave imagery. At 12:30 Universal Time Coordinated on December 2nd, Bofa neared Palau, with a closest distance of 50 kilometers, 31 miles. At that time, the system's outflow improved, and convection near the eye thickened. Citation needed. Early on December 3rd, due to the eye wall replacement cycle, the system weakened slightly into a Category 3 typhoon. However, a few hours later, as the eye wall replacement cycle ended, Bofa re-intensified into a Category 4 typhoon, while the eye became well-defined again. 25. Late on December 3rd, as the system continued to strengthen, the system rapidly intensified into a Category 5 super typhoon, deepening to an unofficial pressure of 918 bar, HPA, 27.11 nhg, as stated by the JTWC at peak intensity. 26, as the eye started to become well-defined at 27 kilometers, 17 miles across. The system's convection also became more compact and organized. At that time, an anticyclone located northeast of Bofa continued to provide ample radial outflow and low vertical wind shear over the system, causing favorable conditions, leading to its re-intensification. Bofa had its secondary peak intensity in the South China Sea. At 20:45 Universal Time Coordinated on December 3rd, 4:45 December 4th local time, Bofa made landfall over Baganga, Davao Oriental, as a Category 5 super typhoon, and the eye dissipated just an hour after landfall. 1. Bofa began to weaken, with convection on the eastern side of the storm decreasing as it moved through the Sulu Sea. It made landfall on the island of Palawan on December 5, before briefly weakening to a tropical storm on December 6. 27. The JMA continued tracking the system as a typhoon. Overnight, the convection around the storm center weakened, but made another burst on December 7th, with an eye-like feature shown only in microwave imagery. After a few hours, the system re-intensified into a Category 1 typhoon and developed a 27 kilometers, 17 miles, well-defined eye. Late on December 7th, Bofa's central dense overcast started to increase slightly, 28, and the typhoon rapidly intensified from a Category 1 to a Category 4 typhoon in only 6 hours, 26. Upon re-intensifying, Bofa developed a well-defined eye that had deep convection near the center of the storm. 29. On December 8, the system started to weaken due to increasing moderate wind shear. 30. Late on December 8th into December 9th, Bofa weakened rapidly from a typhoon to a tropical storm, with its convection being blown to the northeast by wind shear, exposing the low-level circulation center. The remaining thin convection in the center consisted of few convective thunderstorms associated with stratocumulus clouds. PSWS map and path during the passage of Super Typhoon Bopha, Pablo, in Mindanao and southern Visayas. Initially, the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, NDRRMC, advised the citizens of Iligan and Cagayan de Oro to prepare for the impact of the storm, as they really did not want a repeat of severe tropical storm Washi, which had hit when people were asleep and, therefore, had caused a large number of deaths. On December 2, the NDRRMC put parts of the central and southeastern Philippines on high alert. Relief food and medicines had been prepositioned while thousands of people along the country's eastern border were being prepared for evacuation to safer ground in preparation for the Typhoon 38, with Bopha expected to strike Mindanao and Visayas, as well as areas in southern Tagalog and Metro Manila. The possibility of landslides was advised in Surigao, Davao, Compostela Valley, Misamis, Bukidnon, Llano del Norte, Llano del Sur, Zamboanga, Leyte, Cebu, Bohol, Negros, Panay, and Mindoro. 39. Keep updated on the bulletins from Tagasa. Always cooperate with the local authorities as the national government is all ready to provide all assistance to those that may be affected, Vault said. 40. Also, disaster authorities in Baikal were alerted and getting ready with their disaster contingency plan as the typhoon was closing in. On December 3, around 2,000 families living in Hinatuan, on the province of Surigao del Sur, were evacuated. Since schools would be turned into evacuation centers, Candelario Viola, the mayor of Hinatuan, ordered the suspension of all classes in the town. 41. Ma Roxas, the Interior and Local Government Secretary, said that National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council's disaster monitoring systems were set up in several regions across the Philippines. In accordance with President Aquino's marching orders to ensure zero casualties from disasters, as much as possible, I have ordered our regional directors to make sure that the necessary precautions are undertaken to mitigate the effects of Tropical Storm Bopha, he said. We have our existing protocols, and it is just a matter of implementing them and making other necessary preparations as appropriate. Roxas added. 42. As preparations continued, Storm Signal Number 1 was declared over Siquijor, Bohol, Belaran, Camotes Island, Cebu, Southern Leyte, Eastern Samar, Western Samar, Surigao del Norte, Siargao Island, Dinagat Island, Agusan del Norte, Agusan del Sur, rest of Davao Oriental, Davao del Norte including Samo Island, Compostela Valley, Bukidnon, Misamis Occidental, Misamis Oriental, Camiguin, Llano del Norte and Llano del Sur. Also, Signal Number 2 was raised over Surigao del Sur and the northern part of Davao Oriental. 43. The National Police, Coast Guard, PCG, and Navy had placed their personnel on standby and their disaster response units in preparation for Bopha's impact. We are ready to conduct rescue operations in flooded areas. Let us warn operators of small vessels, motor benkas, and fishing boats to avoid sailing in the southeastern and eastern section of the country where the sea is rough, said PCG spokesman Commander Armand Balailo. 44. After staying in the South China Sea for at least 4 days, Pablo again threatened the western sections of northern Luzon, and by the afternoon of December 8, public storm warning signal number 2 was raised over 3 provinces, and 11 provinces were inside signal number 1. 45. Forecasters said the storm had turned and is due to hit the Philippines on December 9. 46. Typhoon Bopha made landfall over Mindanao on December 4, destroying homes, cutting power and forcing the cancellation of flights and ferry services. There was only one confirmed death at that moment, but local media said people were injured by flying debris and falling trees. 59. Typhoon Bopha packed winds of up to 175 miles per hour when it struck the island nation, bringing torrential rains that flattened entire villages, leaving thousands homeless, as well as washing out roads and bridges needed by rescue personnel trying to reach stricken regions. 60. The death toll from Bopha rose to 82 as rescuers attempted to reach areas cut off in flash floods and mudslides. There were 49 fatalities in a mudslide in the mountainous town of New Bataan alone, and another 33 died in rural settlements elsewhere in Mindanao. 61. Joe Curry, the Philippines head of Catholic Relief Services, said, "Authorities seem more prepared to deal with this storm. So far there's been more preparedness efforts at this time, but I think we're going to see the damage reports come out later today and tomorrow." 62. 63. Flood waters rampaged down a mountain, engulfing emergency shelters and washing away an army truck, the Associated Press, AP, reported. 64. The typhoon had affected more than 213,000 people, demolished houses and stranded people in 2 provinces and parts of the Visayas region, according to a disaster agency. More than 179,000 people were in evacuation centers. School classes were suspended in many cities, and dozens of flights were canceled, according to the National Disaster Agency. Nearly 5,000 travelers had been left stranded at ports across the country as of December 5 because of disruption to ferry services. 65. December 5. Lieutenant Colonel Lyndon Panayza of the Army's 10th Infantry Division said fatalities from Compostela Valley had gone up to 142, 69 of whom were from a flash flood the previous day in New Bataan. 66. Electrical poles snapped like matchsticks as Bopha's devastating winds howled across Mindanao, leaving large swaths of territory without power. It was the strongest weather disturbance to hit the South in 2 decades, the government said. Defense Undersecretary Benito Ramos, who heads the National Disaster and Relief Council, didn't give any financial estimate of the damage to agriculture and infrastructure caused by Bopha, saying estimates were still being collected. 67. Arthur Roy, governor of the worst-hit province, Compostela Valley in Mindanao, said raging water and mud from the mountains had swept through school buildings, covered courts, town halls, and health centers where residents had taken shelter. The death toll in the province stood at 150. The waters came so suddenly and unexpectedly, and the winds were so fierce, that compounded the loss of lives and livelihood, Roy told Reuters in a telephone interview. He said farm water catchment basins atop mountains had given way due to the torrential rains, sending down heavy volumes of water to the flatlands below. Damage to agriculture and infrastructure in Compostela Valley province could reach at least 4 billion pesos, equivalent to 75 million euros or $98 million US, with the typhoon destroying 70 to 80% of plantations, mostly bananas for export, Roy said. 68. By the evening of December 5, 280 fatalities had been reported on the islands with hundreds missing, while rescuers were attempting to reach areas cut off by floods and mudslides. The Civil Defense Office said that at least 326 people had been confirmed dead and another 379 remained missing. In Compostela Valley province alone, at least 184 people died, many when flash floods had hit emergency shelters where they had taken refuge. 80. Social Welfare Secretary Corazon Solomon said the government had sought help from the Swiss-based International Organization for Migration to build temporary shelters for Bopha survivors. President Benigno Aquino III sent Navy ships with food and other supplies to 150,000 people on Mindanao's east coast, where 3 towns remained cut off by landslides and wrecked bridges. Officials said many of the Mindanao victims were poor migrants who had flocked by the thousands to mountainous, landslide-prone sites like the towns of New Batan and Mancao to work at unregulated small-scale gold mines. 81. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies issued an urgent appeal for $4.8 million to help people directly affected by the typhoon. We had a problem of where to take the evacuees. All the evacuation centers have lost their roofs, Davao Oriental Governor Corazon Nunez Malañan said. 82. Later that day, 475 were confirmed dead, and the government appealed for international help. Philippines disaster chief says 647 deaths have been confirmed and is likely to rise. 780 people are still missing, including hundreds of fishermen. 2. The storm has caused crop damage worth 8.5 billion pesos, $210 million. The death toll reached 1,067 people, with most in Mindanao, where floods and landslides caused major damage on December 4. A total of 834 people remain missing, about half of them are fishermen. Typhoon Haiyan, known in the Philippines as Super Typhoon Yolanda, was an extremely powerful and catastrophic tropical cyclone that is among the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded. Upon making landfall, Haiyan devastated portions of Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines during early November 2013. 1. It is one of the deadliest typhoons on record in the Philippines. 2. Killing at least 6,300 people in the region of Visayas alone. 3. In terms of JTWC estimated 1-minute sustained winds, Haiyan is tied with Marantai in 2016 for being the second strongest landfalling tropical cyclone on record, only behind Goni in 2020. It was also the most intense and deadliest tropical cyclone worldwide in 2013. The 30th named storm, 13th typhoon, and 5th super typhoon of the 2013 Pacific typhoon season, Haiyan originated from a low-pressure area several hundred kilometers east-southeast of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia on November 2. Tracking generally westward, environmental conditions favored tropical cyclogenesis, and the system developed into a tropical depression on the following day. After becoming a tropical storm and receiving the name Haiyan at midnight UTC on November 4, the system began a period of rapid intensification that brought it to typhoon intensity by 1800 hours Universal Time Coordinated on November 5. By November 6, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, JTWC, assessed the system as a Category 5 equivalent super typhoon on the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale, SSHWS. The storm passed over the island of K-Angel in Palau shortly after attaining this strength. The Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical, and Astronomical Services Administration, PAGASA, estimated the average 10-minute sustained winds at 235 km per hour, 146 miles per hour, and gusts up to 275 km per hour, 171 miles per hour, at landfall over Diwan, eastern Samar. Haiyan continued to intensify. At 12 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated on November 7, the Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, upgraded the storm's maximum 10-minute sustained winds to a peak of 230 km per hour, 140 miles per hour. The Hong Kong Observatory put the storm's maximum 10-minute sustained winds at 285 km per hour, 175 miles per hour, prior to landfall in the central Philippines, while the China Meteorological Administration, CMA, estimated the maximum 2-minute sustained winds at the time to be around 78 meters per second or 280 kilometers per hour, 170 miles per hour. At the same time, the JTWC estimated the system's 1-minute sustained winds at 315 km per hour, 195 miles per hour, unofficially making Haiyan the strongest tropical cyclone ever observed based on wind speed, a record which would later be surpassed by Hurricane Patricia in 2015 at 345 kilometers per hour, 215 miles per hour. 5. Haiyan is also tied with Marantai in 2016, Goni in 2020, and Surigi in 2021 as the most intense tropical cyclone in the Eastern Hemisphere by 1-minute sustained winds. Several others have recorded lower central pressure readings. At 2040 Universal Time Coordinated on November 7, the eye of the typhoon made its first landfall in the Philippines at Giwan, Eastern Samar, at peak strength. Gradually weakening, the storm made 5 additional landfalls in the country before emerging over the South China Sea. Turning northwestward, the typhoon eventually struck northern Vietnam as a severe tropical storm on November 10. Haiyan was last noted as a tropical depression by the JMA on the following day. The first warning noted for Haiyan was in November 3, when a storm warning arose in the Federated States of Micronesia, specifically in the Chuk Lagoon, Lozap, and Palawan, gradually expanding to other towns as well. Warnings rose for a second time in Micronesia, before being discontinued. In the Philippines, Pagasa raised signal number 1 on November 6, before the landfall of Haiyan. More provinces were included, until signal number 4, the highest warning, was raised. Other preparations were made, such as class suspensions and evacuations. In China, an emergency was declared in 3 provinces, causing vessels to be brought back to shore. In Vietnam, the highest emergency level was announced, causing thousands of people to be evacuated. In Micronesia, heavy rains scattered in most of the places, causing 1 canoe house and 3 other houses to be destroyed. Other than houses, many trees were down. In Palau, houses were also destroyed. Power outages were reported, with a total of 69 people being displaced. In Taiwan, 8 people died due to strong waves. 1 person was also declared missing in Hong Kong. In southern China, extensive flooding occurred, killing 30 people and destroying 900 homes. In Vietnam, heavy rains battered the country, killing 18 people and injuring 93. Geographical images of Typhoon Haiyan, superimposed, and Hurricane Katrina, 2005, in the Gulf of Mexico for size and cloud top temperature comparison. Intensification slowed somewhat during the day, though the JTWC estimated the storm to have attained Category 5 equivalent super typhoon status on the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale, SSHWS, around 12:00 UTC, NB3-14. Later, the eye of the typhoon passed over the island of K-Angel in Palau, 15. Around 12 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated on November 7, Haiyan attained 10-minute sustained winds of 230 km per hour, 140 miles per hour, and a minimum central pressure of 895 bar, HPA, 26.43 nhg. 9. 6 hours later, the JTWC estimated Haiyan to have attained 1-minute sustained winds of 315 km per hour, 196 miles per hour, and gusts up to 380 km per hour, 240 miles per hour. 16. The storm displayed some characteristics of an annular tropical cyclone, though a strong convective band remained present along the western side of the system. 16. Animated enhanced infrared satellite loop of Typhoon Haiyan from peak intensity to landfall in the Philippines. At 2040 Universal Time Coordinated on November 7, Haiyan made landfall in Diwan, Eastern Samar at peak intensity. 17. The JTWC's unofficial estimate of 1-minute sustained winds of 305 km per hour, 190 miles per hour, would, by that measure, make Haiyan the most powerful storm ever recorded to strike land. This record was later broken by Typhoon Goni in 2020. 19. Interaction with land caused a slight degradation of the storm's structure, though it remained an exceptionally powerful storm when it struck Tolosa, Leyte around 23:00 UTC. 20. The typhoon made 4 additional landfalls as it traversed the Visayas frowny face. 21. Danbantayan and Bantayan Island in Cebu, Concepcion in Iloilo, and Busuanga Island in Palawan. Haiyan, with its core disrupted by land interaction with the Philippines, emerged over the South China Sea late on November 8, 22. Environmental conditions ahead of the storm soon became less favorable, as cool stable air began wrapping into the western side of the storm's circulation. 23. Continuing across the South China Sea, Haiyan turned more northwesterly late on November 9 and through November 10, as it moved around the southwestern edge of the subtropical ridge previously steering it westward. 24. Rapid weakening ensued as Haiyan approached its final landfall in Vietnam. 25. Ultimately moving ashore in the country near Haiphong around 2100 hours Universal Time Coordinated, as a severe tropical storm. 9. Once on shore, the storm quickly deteriorated and was last noted as it dissipated over Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region, China, on November 11. 9. Preparations. Micronesia and Palau. Upon JTWC's declaration of Tropical Depression 31W on November 3, a tropical storm warning was issued for Chuuk Lagoon, Lozap, and Palawan in the Federated States of Micronesia. Further west, Fairlip, Satawal, and Woliai were placed under a typhoon watch while Fananil and Yilol were placed under a tropical storm watch. 26. The following day, the tropical storm warning expanded to include Satawal while a typhoon warning was issued for Woliai. 27. Much of Yap State and the islands of Koror and K-Angel in Palau were placed under a typhoon watch. 28. The government issued a mandatory evacuation for K-Angel, and although most residents ignored the warning, they all survived the storm. 15. As Haiyan progressed westward, the easternmost advisories were gradually discontinued. 28. As Haiyan intensified into a typhoon on November 5, warnings were raised across Palau and Yap State. 29. 30. Government offices in Melacao were used as an evacuation building for Palau. 31. Despite mandatory evacuation orders, most residents on K-Angel remained on the island and rode out the typhoon. 15. Philippines. Officials placed police officers in the Bicol region ahead of the storm. 37. In the provinces of Samar and Leyte, classes were cancelled, and residents in flood and landslide-prone areas were required to evacuate. 38. Some of the storm-threatened areas were affected by an earlier earthquake in Bohol. 39. Then Philippine President Noynoy Aquino requested the military to deploy planes and helicopters to the region expected to be affected. 40. As Haiyan was moving very fast, Pagasa issued warnings at different levels to about 60 of the 80 provinces, including the capital Metro Manila. 41. On November 8, the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters was activated, providing widespread charitable satellite coverage to relief organizations. On November 8, Prime Minister Nguyen Tan Dun activated the highest state of preparedness in the country. 46. Approximately 600,000 people across southern and central provinces were evacuated, while a further 200,000 were evacuated in northern provinces. Alerts were sent to 85,328 seagoing vessels, with a collective crew of 385,372 people, to sail to safer waters away from the storm. Requests were sent to China, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines to aid any fishermen who needed immediate shelter from the typhoon. 47. Threatening Vietnam after two other typhoons, Wudip and Nari, there were concerns that the storm would cause significant damage to homes with makeshift repairs. 48. Roughly 460,000 military personnel and other authorities were mobilized to assist in evacuation efforts. 47. Hundreds of flights were canceled across the country while schools were closed on November 11th.